The nurse's hands trembled as the doctor read the DNA report out loud. The billionaire's name glowed at the top of the page, Sterling Vance. But what no one in that Missouri hospital could explain was how the unborn child's mother was still medically verified a virgin. The hallway fell silent. Sterling just stared, a man who had been declared infertile 20 years ago, now being told he was going to be a father. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. In the gentle hills outside Columbia, Missouri, Sterling Vance lived in a sprawling farmhouse that once overflowed with laughter. Now it was quiet, too quiet. He had made his fortune decades earlier, investing in clean energy and technology long before it became fashionable. By 61, he had built not just wealth, but influence. Yet, with all the success came a silence he couldn't buy his way out of. His wife, Nora, had passed after a long fight with ovarian cancer. They never had children. The doctors had told them years ago that Sterling was infertile. At first, he had fought the diagnosis, chasing second opinions and experimental treatments. But eventually he stopped. The hope of ever hearing a child's laughter in his home faded into something else, a quiet kind of resignation. He spent the following years giving back. He funded medical clinics, scholarships, and community outreach programs across Missouri. His name was engraved on hospital wings and research centers, but he never showed up for the ribbon cuttings. He didn't need applause. He just needed to feel useful again. One of those small-town programs, a women's health clinic in Jefferson City, was where Naomi Holt worked. She wasn't the kind of woman who stood out in a crowd, yet people never forgot her. There was something unshakable about her calm, her gentleness. She was 28, soft-spoken, and known for staying late long after everyone else went home. Naomi's coworkers often joked that she was too pure for this world. Raised in the church, she lived a quiet life, working hard and keeping to herself. Sterling first heard of her through a report, a note from his foundation mentioning her exceptional care for underprivileged patients. She wasn't chasing promotions or recognition, she just wanted to help. That caught his attention. When he eventually met her at a charity event, Sterling noticed the same thing everyone did, her peace. She had this way of making broken people feel seen. He envied that. The two spoke briefly about her clinic's challenges. Funding cuts, outdated equipment, patients they couldn't always treat. Sterling listened longer than usual, promising nothing, but remembering everything. A week later, Naomi received an anonymous donation through the foundation, large enough to keep her clinic open for another year. She suspected it was Sterling, but he never said a word. Sterling wasn't looking for friendship or connection. In truth, he avoided both. He'd grown used to polite conversations that ended in nothing. Yet, he found himself thinking about the nurse with kind eyes, the one who didn't ask for anything. One December evening, he attended a fundraising gala in downtown Columbia. It was one of those events filled with polite laughter and shallow speeches. Sterling smiled, nodded, and felt nothing. Then, halfway through the evening, the room began to spin. A sharp pain hit his chest, and before anyone could react, he collapsed. The crowd panicked. Paramedics were called. Sterling Vance, the billionaire philanthropist, was rushed to Boone Hospital Center. And by coincidence, or fate, depending on how you see it, the nurse assigned to his overnight care was Naomi Holt. She didn't recognize him at first. His usual tailored suits were gone, replaced by a hospital gown and tired eyes. He was pale, weak, vulnerable, not the man she'd seen at the fundraiser. As the night stretched on, Sterling drifted in and out of sleep, hearing her voice quietly humming a tune while checking his vitals. It wasn't a song from the radio, more like an old hymn. It felt like warmth in a cold place. By morning, his condition stabilized. He insisted on discharging himself against medical advice, claiming he had work to do. Naomi knew better. She left him with a simple note tucked under his discharge papers: "Don't forget that your heart needs rest too." Sterling read it that night in his empty house. It stayed on his desk for months, a small reminder that maybe not everyone cared about his money. That winter was long, quiet, and gray. But something about that nurse lingered in his thoughts, her patience, her steady voice, her honesty. She reminded him of what he used to believe before money complicated everything. He started checking on her clinic anonymously, sending small grants when equipment broke or supplies ran low. Each act felt strangely personal, though he told himself it wasn't. Then came the letter. Naomi's clinic had been notified that their main funding source was being withdrawn. Without support, they'd have to close in less than 2 weeks. Sterling made a decision that night that surprised even himself. He drove to Jefferson City without his assistant or his driver, arriving at the clinic before dawn. The place was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like surrender. He walked the hallways alone, remembering what it used to feel like to have purpose. That morning, he signed a check large enough to keep the clinic running for 5 years. He didn't want thanks. He didn't even leave his name. But Naomi found out. And for the first time, she prayed not for her patients, but for the man who had given her hope. It's strange how one act of kindness can change the rhythm of 2 lives that had nothing in common. That was the beginning, the quiet start to a story that no one, not even science, would one day be able to explain. Some people spend their lives chasing miracles, while others unknowingly become part of one. If stories like this remind you of how faith and kindness can cross paths in ways no one expects, stay. Because what happens next will make you question what's truly impossible. For several months after Sterling's hospital stay, life returned to its familiar quiet rhythm. He focused on business, charity projects, and the endless paperwork that came with maintaining a legacy. But something inside him had shifted. The world around him didn't feel as cold as before. Maybe it was Naomi's influence, or maybe it was that note he still kept tucked in his wallet. Either way, the silence in his home didn't echo quite the same anymore. Meanwhile, in Jefferson City, Naomi continued her work at the clinic. She was content, though something about her life felt different too. She couldn't explain it, but she felt more connected, as though a door inside her had been opened without her realizing it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late April when a violent storm rolled through Missouri. Roads flooded, power flickered, and the hospital filled with emergencies. Naomi was working the night shift, moving from room to room, checking on patients when her supervisors stopped her with a clipboard. A new patient had been admitted, a case of exhaustion and dehydration. The name made her heart pause for a second. Sterling Vance. Apparently, he had been attending a late-night board meeting when he fainted again. His assistant insisted he rest, but Sterling had refused hospitalization until he was too weak to argue. Naomi's instinct was to step aside, but the hospital was short-staffed. Without hesitation, she took the assignment. As the rain beat against the windows, Naomi sat beside Sterling's bed through the long night, monitoring his pulse and fluids. He was frail, his once sharp features softened by fatigue. Yet, even unconscious, there was a calm about him, the kind that comes from someone who's learned to live with loneliness. When he finally opened his eyes hours later, Naomi was still there. She simply smiled, checked his vitals, and reminded him, quietly, almost like a whisper, that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who need help the most. Over the next few days, she remained part of his care rotation. She never treated him as a billionaire, just as another patient who needed time and patience. Sterling noticed the difference. There were no favors, no special treatment, only genuine compassion. By the end of the week, his health improved. The morning he was discharged, Sterling left behind a sealed envelope with Naomi's name on it. Inside was a note and a modest donation for her clinic. Nothing grand. Just enough to say thank you. Then he disappeared again. Naomi returned to her routine, thinking that was the end of it. But life has a strange way of looping back when we least expect it. Months passed. Summer gave way to the gold and rust colors of Missouri autumn. The clinic was busier than ever, yet Naomi began to feel unwell, waves of dizziness, fatigue, and nausea she couldn't explain. She dismissed it as exhaustion. But when the symptoms persisted, a colleague urged her to get tested. The results stunned her. She was pregnant. For hours, Naomi sat in the exam room staring at the paper. The nurse tried to comfort her, assuming there was a man involved, maybe a hidden relationship. But Naomi said nothing. Because there wasn't one. She had never been with anyone. Not once in her life. The doctors were confused but professional. They repeated the tests. The result was the same. Pregnant. Word spread quietly through the clinic. Some whispered, others laughed in disbelief. But Naomi didn't defend herself. She didn't even try to explain. Deep down, she didn't know what to say. Weeks turned into months, and still, she told no one outside the clinic. Her faith told her to trust that there was purpose in everything, even this. By December, her condition was obvious. She faced questions she couldn't answer and scrutiny she never asked for. The once peaceful nurse was now the center of silent judgment everywhere she went. Then one morning, she received a letter from a private hospital in Colombia. It was from Sterling Vance's Medical Research Foundation, requesting her presence for an urgent and confidential matter. Naomi's hands shook as she read the letter. There was no reason for the foundation to contact her directly. She almost threw it away, but something inside urged her to go. When she arrived, she was escorted quietly through the back entrance. A physician greeted her, one of the same doctors who had treated Sterling earlier that year. His face was pale, uneasy. He handed Naomi a sealed envelope and asked her to read it before leaving the building. Inside were lab results, genetic comparisons run through multiple independent facilities. The results listed two names, Subject A, Naomi Harlow. Subject B, Sterling Vance. At the bottom of the page was a single, impossible conclusion. Genetic link confirmed, 99.98% paternal match. Naomi dropped the paper, her heart pounding. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The doctor explained in fragments that Sterling had been undergoing routine tests for an upcoming surgery when anomalies appeared. His DNA matched with a new entry, hers. The samples were cross-verified multiple times, all showing the same link. It was scientifically unexplainable. Naomi's pregnancy was biologically connected to a man who had been infertile for 2 decades. That night, Naomi sat alone in her small apartment, the Missouri winter pressing against the windows. She stared at the ultrasound photo on the table, her mind caught between fear and faith. If this was real, then it wasn't just a medical error, it was something beyond reason. And somewhere across town, Sterling Vance was sitting in his office, holding the same report. His expression unreadable. His world, for the second time in his life, completely undone. The next morning, Sterling ordered a private investigation. But before the results could arrive, Naomi vanished. No calls, no forwarding address, nothing. Winter stretched on in Missouri, bitter and gray. For Sterling Vance, the season carried a weight that even his millions couldn't melt. Naomi's disappearance had stirred something deep in him, something that wasn't about science or logic, but conscience. He had built his empire on control. Every move calculated, every risk measured. But this defied every rule he had lived by. He had spent decades convincing himself that emotions were distractions, that love and faith were luxuries for people who didn't have real responsibilities. Yet now, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had shown him compassion when no one else dared to. Weeks turned into months. Sterling's investigators combed every lead, her old apartment, the clinic, her church, even the small diner she used to frequent before work. She was nowhere. It was as if Naomi had vanished into the earth. The more he searched, the more he began to realize something unsettling. Naomi had left not out of fear of him, but to protect whatever truth was inside her. In the meantime, the story began to leak. A tabloid picked up rumors about a mysterious nurse connected to billionaire philanthropist Sterling Vance. They didn't have proof, but in today's world, truth doesn't matter as much as curiosity. Suddenly, Sterling's name was in headlines again, not for his business success, but for scandal. His board members advised silence. His PR team begged him to issue a statement denying everything. But Sterling said nothing. He couldn't deny what he didn't understand. Around the same time, Naomi found herself living quietly in a small town on the outskirts of St. Charles County. She had left Jefferson City without a trace, changing her number and even her mailing address. She rented a modest farmhouse and lived off savings, keeping to herself. Her belly had grown, and so had her faith. Despite the whispers, despite the confusion, she felt peace. A peace that made no sense but filled her heart every morning when she woke up to the sound of her own heartbeat and the faint rhythm of another. She didn't want fame. She didn't want money. She just wanted to protect her child and keep the world's chaos far away. But one afternoon, as she sat on her porch reading, a car pulled into the long gravel driveway. It wasn't an investigator this time. It was someone she recognized from a distance, Sterling's driver, and behind him, Sterling himself, stepping out slowly, visibly weaker than before. He had found her. That night, under the low glow of the porch light, Sterling and Naomi faced one another after nearly a year of silence. There were no words between them, only a quiet understanding that whatever bound them went beyond logic. Sterling didn't ask why she left. Naomi didn't ask how he found her. Some truths don't need to be forced, they unfold in their own time. Over the following weeks, Sterling rented a place nearby and began visiting the small farmhouse regularly. Sometimes he brought groceries. Other times, he just sat on the porch with Naomi and listened as the wind carried the sounds of the nearby river. For the first time, he wasn't the man who owned skyscrapers or signed billion-dollar deals. He was simply a man learning how to be human again. Then came the day Naomi went into labor. A cold March morning when the snow was melting but the air still bit with frost. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, where Sterling stayed in the waiting room, silent and motionless, for hours. When the doctor finally came out, his expression was unreadable. He handed Sterling a blanket. Inside, a newborn girl with dark curls and eyes that held the same strange softness Naomi carried. The child was healthy, strong, and unmistakably connected to them both. In that moment, Sterling felt something he hadn't felt in years, tears. Not of loss, but of release. For once, he didn't feel like a man cursed by circumstance. He felt chosen for something far more sacred than success. He made a decision that night, to protect both Naomi and the child from the glare of the public. He bought the land where Naomi's farmhouse stood, transferred the deed to her name, and set up a trust for the child's future. Then quietly, without fanfare, he stepped away from his corporate life. For months, the world speculated about his sudden disappearance, his silence. But Sterling didn't owe anyone an explanation. For the first time, his life wasn't about proving his worth, it was about living it. Some nights, as he watched Naomi cradle their daughter by the firelight, Sterling thought about how strange life could be. How a man who had everything could still feel empty until the one thing he could never explain found him. And maybe, just maybe, that was what faith really meant. Not understanding everything, but trusting the moments that make you whole again. If only more people believed that kindness could rewrite a story, maybe the world would be softer. If you've ever witnessed a miracle that logic couldn't explain, a second chance, a moment of grace, don't just scroll away. Stories like this remind us that compassion still matters. You can honor that truth by staying, by listening, because some stories deserve to be carried, not forgotten. Just when Sterling thought peace had finally found him, a letter arrived one spring morning. It bore no return address, only his name, handwritten in neat script. Inside was a single photograph of Naomi's child, taken by someone outside their home. Someone new. Spring had arrived in Missouri, and with it came a fragile sense of renewal. The trees that bordered Naomi's farmhouse swayed gently under soft sunlight, and the sound of birds filled the quiet mornings. For Sterling Vance, every sunrise in that place felt like redemption. He had traded his suits for sweaters, his boardrooms for long walks on gravel roads, and his ambition for the laughter of a little girl learning how to walk. But the letter changed everything. It came without warning. A plain envelope slipped into the old farmhouse mailbox, addressed simply to Mr. Sterling Vance. There was no sender, no stamp. Just his name in perfect handwriting. Inside, a single photograph showed Naomi holding their daughter by the porch steps, the same porch where he'd once sat, thinking they were finally safe. It wasn't the photo that frightened him. It was the faint outline of a shadow reflected in the glass window behind Naomi. Someone had taken it close enough to see her smile. Sterling had spent most of his life surrounded by security, cameras, and contracts. But this was different. This wasn't a reporter or a curious neighbor. This felt personal, intentional. For days, he didn't tell Naomi. He couldn't bear to break the fragile calm she had built. Instead, he doubled the farm's security quietly, hiring a private guard to monitor the area at night. He even replaced the locks, though he never explained why. But peace built on silence doesn't last long. Naomi began to sense the change in him, how his eyes would linger by the window a little too long, how he would check his phone during dinner, waiting for calls that never came. And though she didn't ask, she knew something was coming. The following week, another letter appeared. This time, it contained a single sentence written in the same neat handwriting. "You don't get to hide the truth forever." Sterling felt the words like ice in his chest. He had built empires from nothing, fought rivals twice as powerful, and buried every rumor that could destroy his reputation. But now, in this quiet corner of Missouri, someone had found the one secret he couldn't explain: Naomi's pregnancy and the child that even medicine said was impossible. He began to wonder if this was punishment, a reminder that even miracles can be tested. In the days that followed, his health began to falter. He ignored the symptoms at first: the shortness of breath, the trembling hands, the fatigue. He told himself it was stress, the weight of old habits creeping back. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It wasn't just his body giving in, it was the burden of guilt he had carried all his life. Naomi noticed. She saw how he'd grown thinner, how his eyes seemed distant, as if he was living in two worlds, one where he'd found peace and another haunted by ghosts of his past. She tried to pull him back, but some battles are fought inside the soul, not in words. One evening, a storm rolled in across the valley. Thunder cracked through the air as Naomi rocked their daughter to sleep. Sterling sat by the window, staring at the rain hitting the glass. The wind howled, rattling the farmhouse walls, but inside, everything was still. He thought about his father, a man who had built his own empire on fear and control. He remembered the nights he'd been told that feelings were for the weak, that success was measured only in profit. And he realized then how much of his life had been spent chasing approval from ghosts. The miracle that had entered his life, Naomi, the child, wasn't a mistake or a mystery. It was a second chance. But like all second chances, it came with a test. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sterling finally told Naomi about the letters. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked at him with a kind of quiet strength he had never seen before. In that moment, he understood that fear doesn't protect love, it only delays its courage. He promised her he would face whatever truth was coming. Not as a billionaire, not as a man who had once controlled everything, but as a father, and as someone who finally believed that miracles deserve protection, not shame. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was washed clean, and the air smelled of wet earth. Sterling stepped outside and found a black car parked by the edge of the road, unmarked, engine off, windows tinted. No one inside moved. He stood there for several minutes, waiting. But the car never left. When he finally turned back toward the farmhouse, Naomi was standing in the doorway holding their daughter. Her expression was calm but heavy with understanding. She didn't need to ask what was wrong, she already knew. And though the air was quiet, there was a tension in it, the kind that comes before revelation. Sterling realized that peace, no matter how carefully built, was never guaranteed. It was a choice, one that had to be defended even when the past came knocking. Later that night, Sterling found a third letter waiting on the porch, this one sealed with a wax emblem he hadn't seen in years. When he opened it, his hands shook. Inside was a copy of Naomi's original hospital record, and at the bottom, a name circled in red ink. It wasn't his. The night was silent except for the soft hum of crickets outside. Sterling sat alone at the dining table, the opened letter resting in front of him like a wound he couldn't close. The hospital record was old, creased, and faintly smudged, but one thing stood out: the name circled in red at the bottom, Dr. Ellis Crane. He hadn't heard that name in years. Dr. Crane had once been his family physician, back when Sterling was still married and desperately trying to conceive. He had handled the fertility treatments, the tests, the procedures, the endless consultations that all led to disappointment. When Crane retired abruptly, Sterling hadn't thought much of it. But now, seeing his name connected to Naomi's pregnancy felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. For the first time in his life, Sterling didn't rush to act. He didn't call lawyers or investigators or reporters. He just sat there, trying to breathe. The next morning, he drove alone to the city, back to the same hospital where Naomi had once worked. He hadn't been there in over a year, but the building still smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a strange mix of life and exhaustion. He asked quietly for the records department, using his old connections to gain access to Dr. Crane's archived files. Hours later, after digging through dozens of folders, he found it, Naomi's record, updated the same week she had vanished. Inside was a note from Crane himself, written in neat, tired handwriting. Patient presented unexplained conception. Previous history indicates virginity confirmed. No viable donor matches. Conducted private follow-up. Fetus DNA sample inconclusive. Outcome unexplainable by medical standards. Advised patient to leave city for safety until further clarity. Sterling stared at the note for a long time. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't deceit. It was something beyond science, something no one, not even a doctor, could explain. He realized then that Naomi hadn't hidden from him because of guilt or shame. She had been protecting a miracle, one that people like him, who demanded evidence for everything, could never fully understand. Driving back through the long Missouri highways, Sterling felt something loosen in his chest. For the first time, he didn't need answers. He just needed peace. When he arrived home, Naomi was sitting by the fireplace, their daughter asleep in her arms. The soft light of the flames cast a glow around them, and for a moment, the world felt still. Sterling placed the letter quietly on the table beside her and sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Naomi looked at him, and their eyes met, full of the kind of understanding that no words could carry. He had spent his whole life chasing certainty. Yet here he was, finding joy in what couldn't be explained. As weeks passed, Sterling began rebuilding life from the ground up. He sold his downtown mansion and donated much of his wealth to local hospitals and women's shelters. Not as publicity, but as atonement. He knew now that legacy wasn't measured by headlines, it was measured by hearts you chose to protect when no one was watching. Naomi returned to work part-time as a nurse in a small community clinic nearby. Her kindness made her a quiet legend in the town, the nurse who listened more than she spoke, who stayed after hours just to comfort patients who had no family left. Their daughter, whom they named Hope Elise Vance, grew into a bright, curious child. And though Sterling never told her the full story, she would sometimes ask him why he smiled whenever he looked at her. He would always give the same answer, because she reminded him that some of life's greatest blessings arrive without reason, and some truths are too beautiful to question. Years later, when Sterling passed away peacefully in his sleep, Naomi found a letter among his things. It was written in his familiar, deliberate handwriting. If the world ever asks how this happened, tell them it wasn't a miracle made to be explained. It was love finding its way where it wasn't supposed to. And if anyone doubts you, just let them see hope. Naomi read the letter with trembling hands, her heart full and quiet. The world outside was calm, the Missouri sun bright through the windows. She looked at her daughter playing in the yard, laughter echoing across the fields, and whispered softly, almost to herself, that love, when real, doesn't need proof. Some stories aren't meant to make sense, they're meant to remind us that not everything pure has an explanation. Maybe that's the point of faith, to believe in something when every fact says you shouldn't. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever held on to hope when everything said you couldn't, then don't just pass by. Because stories like this only live on when people who still believe in grace keep them alive.